She watched in horror as three men surrounded her wheelchair-bound friend in the supermarket parking lot. They laughed. They mocked. They stepped closer. She begged them to stop, but her pleas only made them bolder. They didn't know the boy was a biker's son. They didn't know his father was 20 meters away. And they definitely didn't know the homeless girl they were spitting on had just sent a message that would summon 700 hell angels. In 11 minutes, the ground would shake. But before that, the cruelty got worse. And what they did next crossed a line no apology could erase. Before we dive deeper into the story, tell us where you are watching from. We'd love to know how far stories like this one travels. Please the subscription button and help us grow. Now let us dive into the story. She didn't always live like this. That's important to say first, because people tend to reduce a homeless person to a single moment in time, as if their entire life began the day they lost a roof. But her life had a before. A quiet one. An ordinary one. And then a long stretch of surviving that taught her lessons most people never have to learn. Her name was Lena. Most mornings she woke before the sun. Not because she wanted to, but because sleep came lightly when you didn't know who might wander past in the dark. She folded her blanket carefully every time, smoothing the frayed edges like it still mattered. Dignity, she'd learned, was something you had to protect on purpose once the world stopped offering it to you. She stayed near the supermarket because it was predictable. Predictable meant safer. The employees recognized her. Some ignored her. A few nodded. One woman sometimes left a cup of coffee by the curb without saying a word. Lena never chased kindness. She accepted it quietly, the way you accept rain when you've been thirsty too long to complain. People passed her every day without seeing her. And that was fine. Being invisible hurt less than being looked at with disgust. But there was one person who always saw her. The boy. He came with his father in the mornings sometimes, when the store was quiet and the parking lot still cool from the night air. He sat in a wheelchair that looked a little too big for him, his feet resting carefully on the metal supports, his hands folded like he was holding onto patience itself. The first time Lena noticed him, he was watching her feed a stray cat. Not staring. Watching. There's a difference. Does he have a name? He asked her. She looked up, surprised. Adults never asked her questions. Kids did sometimes. Kids hadn't learned yet who society had decided didn't matter. Yes, she said. I call him Rusty. The boy smiled, wide and genuine, the kind of smile that wasn't trying to impress anyone. His father stood behind him, silent but attentive, the way good parents always are. Lena nodded to him out of respect. He nodded back. That was it. No big moment. No dramatic connection. Just two people noticing each other. After that, they started talking whenever they crossed paths. About simple things. The cat. The weather. Which cereal boxes had the best prizes inside. The boy liked engines, she learned. Motorcycles especially. He could tell them apart by sound alone. He talked about them with the kind of joy that made you forget, for a moment, what his body couldn't do. Lena never asked why he used a wheelchair. He never asked why she slept outside. Somehow, that made the friendship feel cleaner. More honest. Sometimes she'd hold the door open for them. Sometimes the boy's father would bring her a sandwich, setting it down like it was no big deal, like she was just another neighbor. He never hovered. Never pitted. Just treated her like a person who existed. That mattered more than he probably knew. Because Lena knew exactly what it felt like to be surrounded and unprotected. She knew what it felt like when adults looked away. When voices laughed instead of helped. When your fear was entertainment. She'd learned early in life that if you didn't draw your own line, people would keep stepping closer until there was nowhere left to stand. She'd learned that silence didn't keep you safe. It just made you smaller. So when she saw the three men that afternoon, her body reacted before her mind could catch up. She noticed the way they moved first. The loose confidence. The boredom. The way their laughter carried no warmth. She'd seen that look before, in places where power was mistaken for cruelty and cruelty for fun. She watched them notice the boy. She watched their attention sharpen. She saw the shift happen, that subtle moment when teasing turns into something else. Something meaner. Her chest tightened. She told herself to stay still. To stay quiet. To stay invisible. That was the smart thing to do. But then she saw the boy's hands grip the armrests. Saw his smile fade into confusion. Saw his eyes flick to his father, then back again, searching for understanding. And something old and unhealed inside her refused to stay silent. Because no one had stepped in for her. Because she remembered exactly what it felt like to be young and scared and surrounded. Because once you know what that feels like, you don't unsee it. She stood up before she realized she'd made the decision. Her legs shook a little. Not from fear, from resolve. The kind that comes when you know you might pay a price, but you're willing to anyway. She didn't think of herself as brave. She wasn't trying to be anything at all. She just knew there was a line she wouldn't let anyone cross. Not again. Not today. The boy had learned patience the way other kids learned to run. Not because he wanted to, but because life demanded it of him early. His legs didn't obey the way he wished they would. They never had. Doctors used careful words, the kind meant to soften reality, but reality didn't need translation. He moved through the world seated, watching it from a few inches lower than everyone else, learning how to read faces, tones, pauses. He noticed things most people missed. What he lacked in strength, he made up for in curiosity. He loved engines. Loved how they sounded before you ever saw them. Loved the promise in that low rumble, the idea of motion, momentum, freedom. He could identify motorcycles the way other kids identified birds, by sound alone. It gave him something solid to hold on to, something powerful that didn't require his body to change. He laughed easily. Asked questions adults weren't prepared for. And he hated being treated like he was fragile. Especially by strangers. But when his father was nearby, none of that seemed to matter as much. Because his father never saw him as broken. He saw him as capable. Their bond wasn't loud or showy. It lived in small things. The way his father always made sure the wheelchair was locked before stepping away. The way he spoke to him at eye level, never down. The way he waited, always waited, without rushing him, without finishing his sentences. When the boy talked about engines, his father listened like it mattered. Because to him, it did. He never interrupted. Never dismissed. Never corrected the boy's excitement. He treated it with respect, the same way he treated everything else in his life. The man himself didn't stand out. That was the thing. He wore plain clothes. Clean boots. His posture was straight, his movements economical, like someone who didn't waste energy. He didn't fidget. Didn't raise his voice. When he entered a space, he didn't announce himself, but people noticed anyway. Not because he demanded attention. Because he carried it. He was the kind of man who spoke less than others, but was listened to more. The kind who didn't need to explain authority because it settled around him naturally, like gravity. When decisions needed to be made, people looked to him without realizing why. Discipline clung to him, not harsh or rigid, but earned. Practiced. Lived. He planned ahead. Checked exits without making it obvious. Positioned himself instinctively between his son and the world, not in a smothering way, but in a way that said, "I'm here. You're safe." And the boy knew it. He trusted his father completely. Not because his father promised him the world, but because he showed up, every single time. Because he never lied. Because when he said, "I've got you," it wasn't comfort, it was fact. They moved together like a unit. Not fused, not dependent, but connected. A rhythm built over years of adapting, adjusting, and refusing to let limitations define who they were. To strangers, They looked like an ordinary father and son running errands. That was the illusion. The truth was, this man had spent his life learning how to lead without shouting, how to command respect without demanding it, how to act decisively without acting recklessly. He understood hierarchy, loyalty, and consequences. He believed in codes, unspoken ones, and he lived by them even when no one was watching. Especially when no one was watching. He had responsibilities that reached far beyond this parking lot. People who answered when he called. People who trusted his judgment without question. But none of that mattered as much to him as the boy at his side. If you watched closely, you could see it in the way his hand hovered near the wheelchair, never touching unless needed. In the way his eyes tracked movement at the edge of his vision, while still staying soft when they landed back on his son. Pride lived there. Quiet. Deep. Unshakable. He wasn't proud in spite of his son's condition. He was proud of who his son was. And that pride shaped everything he did. What looked like an ordinary man was anything but. She stepped closer, putting herself where she didn't belong in the eyes of men who already thought she was nothing. And in that moment, she wasn't homeless. She wasn't invisible. She was just someone standing where someone needed her. That's the part people don't understand about kindness. It's rarely loud. It's rarely dramatic. Most of the time, it's just a quiet refusal to look away. She had nothing, no house, no savings, no safety net. Except one thing. A line she would never let anyone cross. And if you believe no one deserves to be treated as disposable, hit like, bullies hate visibility. The calm didn't shatter all at once. It thinned first. Like air just before a storm, like the moment your body realizes something is wrong before your mind can explain it. They arrived without ceremony. 3 men drifting into the edge of the parking lot as if they belonged there, as if the space had been waiting for them. Their laughter came before their faces did, loud and careless, the kind that carried no joy. It wasn't the sound of people enjoying themselves. It was the sound of people killing time by feeding on others. Boredom clung to them like a second skin. You could see it in the way they leaned, the way they moved with loose confidence, the way their eyes scanned not for friends, but for weakness. They weren't looking for trouble because they were angry. They were looking for it because they were empty. Entitlement followed close behind. The belief that public space belonged to them. That other people existed for their amusement. That consequences were things that happened to someone else. They had that look, the one people learn to recognize only after it's too late. The look that says, "We're untouchable," without a word being spoken. At first, they didn't say anything. They just watched. Watched the boy. Watched the way his wheelchair moved slower than the rest of the world. Watched the way his father stayed close but didn't hover. Watched the homeless girl nearby, half seen, already dismissed. Their eyes lingered on the chair longer than they should have. That was the first tell. Predators don't rush. They assess. One of them nudged another with his elbow, chin tilting toward the boy. A quiet comment passed between them, too low to hear, followed by a snort of laughter. The kind that wasn't shared with the room, only with each other. They took a few steps closer. Not enough to seem threatening. Not yet. Just enough to test the water. To see if anyone would react. To see if the world would push back. It didn't. People were nearby. Shoppers loading groceries. Cars pulling in and out. Life happening at its usual pace. And that silence, that collective decision to mind one's own business, told the men everything they needed to know. No witnesses. No resistance. The boy noticed before anyone else. Kids always do. His shoulders stiffened. His hands tightened around the armrests. His eyes flicked up, searching his father's face, then back to the men again. He didn't say anything, but his body had already understood what his mind was still trying to process. The men smiled when they saw that. That was why they chose him. Not because of who he was, but because of what they believed he couldn't do. They circled wider now, voices louder, their presence pressing in. One of them commented on the chair. Another on the way the boy sat. Their words weren't clever. Cruelty rarely is. It doesn't need intelligence, just permission. They spoke like people who'd never been challenged. Like people who'd learned early that laughter could be a weapon and weakness a target. The father shifted slightly, stepping closer to his son without escalating. His voice stayed calm when he spoke, low and controlled, asking them to move along. No threats. No posturing. Just a boundary stated plainly. That was mistake number one. Because men like this don't respect calm. They interpret it as permission. One of them scoffed, taking another step forward. Close enough now to invade space. Close enough to force a reaction. His tone dripped with mock concern, exaggerated and false. "Relax," he said. "We're just talking." The boy flinched. That was all it took. The laughter sharpened. What had been lazy boredom turned into something more focused, more intentional. The shift was almost imperceptible, but it was there. The moment cruelty decided to stretch its legs. They started calling the boy names. Not loudly. Not yet. Just enough to sting. Just enough to test how far they could go. One of them nudged the wheelchair lightly with his foot, a tap disguised as an accident. The chair moved an inch. The boy gasped. The father's jaw tightened. His posture changed. Still controlled, still restrained, but alert now. A line had been crossed. And that's when the homeless girl stepped closer. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She just spoke, asking them to stop. Asking them to leave the boy alone. Her words were simple. Clear. Human. The men turned toward her slowly. And something ugly flickered across their faces. She wasn't part of the equation they'd calculated. She wasn't supposed to be there. People like her weren't supposed to speak up. Weren't supposed to interfere. That offended them. One of them laughed openly now, eyes raking over her, dismissive and sharp. Another muttered something about trash and nobody. Their words landed like stones, thrown not to wound physically, but to remind her of her place. They spit near the boy's footrest. Deliberate. Close enough to be unmistakable. That was the escalation. Not the words. Not the laughter. The choice to humiliate. The atmosphere changed instantly. The calm that had settled over the parking lot vanished, replaced by tension so thick it felt like pressure against the skin. Conversations nearby faltered. Movements slowed. People sensed something was wrong, but still, no one intervened. Fear has a way of convincing people that silence is safety. The men noticed that too. Their confidence grew. They leaned in closer now, their voices louder, sharper. They fed off the discomfort they were creating. Off the boy's fear. Off the girl's defiance. Off the father's restraint. Because restraint looks like weakness to those who have never learned discipline. The boy's breathing quickened. His hands shook. He tried to pull back, but the chair limited how far he could go. His eyes darted again, searching for reassurance, for an exit that didn't exist. The men saw it. And they smiled. That was the moment the tone truly shifted. From harassment to menace. From teasing to threat. From boredom to intention. This was no longer about killing time. This was about power. And if you're already angry, if your chest is tight and your jaw clenched, comment, "I stand with the vulnerable," because it gets worse. This was the moment the world failed them. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But in the quiet, ordinary way failure usually happens, with people watching, recording, and deciding it wasn't their problem. The parking lot was no longer empty. Cars came and went. A man unloaded groceries from the trunk of his sedan 2 spaces over. A couple paused near the entrance, keys in hand, pretending to search for something in a bag while their eyes stayed fixed on the scene unfolding just a few yards away. Phones came out. Not to call for help. Not to intervene. To film. The three men noticed immediately. They always did. There was a particular shift that happened when an audience formed, when cruelty realized it had spectators instead of consequences. Their posture relaxed even more. Their voices grew louder. They performed now, feeding off the attention, off the fact that no one was stopping them. The homeless girl stood her ground anyway. She asked them again to stop. Her voice cracked slightly this time, not from fear, but from disbelief. From the sickening realization that help wasn't coming. That the adults around her were choosing comfort over conscience. She begged them to leave the boy alone. The words felt familiar as they left her mouth. Too familiar. She had said them before in her life. Different faces. Different places. Same outcome. The men laughed. One of them stepped forward and shoved her shoulder hard enough to make her stumble back. She caught herself before falling, her hands scraping against the rough pavement. The sound echoed louder than it should have, sharp and humiliating. Someone nearby gasped. No one moved. The man sneered at her, his face twisted with satisfaction. "What are you gonna do about it?" he said. "You gonna cry?" Another spat. This time, it landed on her shoe. She froze. Not because she didn't know what to do, but because she did. She wiped it off slowly with the edge of her sleeve, standing back up straight. Her hands trembled now, but her eyes stayed locked on the men. There was no anger there. Just resolve. The kind that comes when you've already lost too much to be intimidated by small, cruel people. The boy watched everything. Every word. Every shove. Every laugh. His face burned with a shame he didn't deserve. His cheeks flushed. His eyes dropped to his lap, to his legs that wouldn't move, to the chair that marked him as different in a world that loved to punish difference. One of the men leaned down toward him, invading his space deliberately. His voice dropped into a mocking whisper that carried just far enough to be heard. "What's wrong?" he said. "Cat got your tongue?" The boy flinched. The men laughed again. The father spoke then. Calm. Controlled. His voice steady, even as his body positioned itself more firmly between his son and the threat. He told them to step away. Told them this wasn't funny. Told them to leave. His restraint only seemed to amuse them. One of the men scoffed loudly. "Or what?" he said. "You gonna do something about it?" The question hung in the air. Everyone waited. The father didn't answer. Because he understood something they didn't. That this wasn't the moment. That reacting the way they wanted would only make things worse, not just for him, but for his son, and for the girl who had already risked too much. The men mistook that silence for victory. They stepped closer again. The circle tightened. The boy's breathing grew shallow. His hands shook openly now. He tried to turn his chair slightly away, but one of the men kicked the wheel lightly, stopping it in place. Not hard. Just enough. Just enough to say, "You're stuck." The sound that left the boy's throat wasn't a scream. It was smaller than that. A choked, broken sound of fear and humiliation that made the air feel heavy, like it was pressing down on everyone who heard it. The homeless girl stepped forward again immediately, without hesitation, without calculation. She put herself between the men and the boy, her back straight, her voice louder now. "Stop," she said. "Please. Just stop." She begged them. The words echoed the opening moments of the nightmare, looping back on themselves like a cruel refrain. She begged them to stop. The men laughed harder. One of them mocked her tone, repeating her words in a high-pitched voice that made his friends howl. Another shook his head, grinning like this was the best entertainment he'd had all week. A woman near the store entrance raised her phone higher, angling for a better shot. A man loading groceries glanced over, then deliberately turned his back. Someone whispered, "This is crazy," but didn't step forward. Fear had wrapped itself around the parking lot, quiet and suffocating. Not the fear of violence, the fear of involvement. The fear of becoming a target. The homeless girl felt it. She felt the absence of support like a physical weight. Like hands pushing her down from all sides. She felt exposed, alone, visible in the worst possible way. Still, she didn't move. Because moving would mean abandoning the boy. And that was the one thing she wouldn't do. The men noticed her resolve and grew irritated by it. Cruelty hates resistance, especially when it comes from someone it considers beneath it. One of them stepped in close enough that she could smell the alcohol on his breath. He leaned down, his voice low and venomous. "You think anyone cares about you," he said. "Look around." She did. And the truth hurt more than his words. The boy watched her face as she looked around the parking lot, watched her eyes take in the people filming, the people pretending not to see, the people waiting for it to be over so they could get on with their day. Something inside him broke then. He felt like it was his fault. Like his body, his chair, his presence had invited this. Like if he were different, if he could stand, if he could run, none of this would be happening. Tears welled in his eyes. He blinked hard, trying to hold them back, trying not to give the men what they wanted. One of them noticed anyway. "Ah," he said, clapping his hands together mockingly. "You gonna cry now?" The boy's lip trembled. The homeless girl turned on him instantly, her voice sharp now, cutting through the laughter. "Don't," she said. "Don't talk to him like that." The man shoved her again, harder this time. She fell. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. The world blurred for a second as her palms scraped against the pavement. Pain flared along her arms, her hip, her pride. The men laughed loudly. Someone in the crowd cursed under their breath. No one stepped in. The father moved immediately, crouching beside her, helping her sit up, checking quickly to see if she was hurt. His touch was gentle, his face controlled, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. The men saw it. And instead of backing off, they leaned into it. "Careful," one of them said, grinning. "You're gonna hurt yourself playing hero." The boy cried openly now, the sound raw and helpless, ripping through the parking lot like a wound. His hands shook violently. He tried to wipe his face, embarrassed, overwhelmed. Humiliated. The men stood taller, feeding off it. This was what they wanted. Control. Power. An audience. The homeless girl pushed herself back up to her feet, ignoring the pain radiating through her body. Her clothes were dirty now. Her hands scraped raw. Her heart pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. She stood again between them and the boy. Because someone had to. Because even when the world fails, someone still has to choose. And as the men laughed, as the phones recorded, as the crowd stood frozen, one truth rang painfully clear through the chaos. She begged them to stop. And no one came. The moment didn't arrive loudly. It arrived in the space between breaths. Between the boy's sobs and the men's laughter. Between the homeless girl pulling herself upright and the father holding his restraint like a clenched fist. Between the world continuing on around them and the small, unbearable truth that no one was coming to help. That's when the boy made a decision. His hands were shaking as he reached into the small pouch attached to the side of his wheelchair. His fingers fumbled, clumsy with fear, before closing around his phone. It slipped once, almost falling, and the sound of it hitting the armrest made him flinch. He looked up at the girl. Not at his father. At her. His eyes were red and wet, but clear. Focused. Braver than anyone had the right to ask a child to be in that moment. "Please," he whispered. Can you send it?" She froze. The phone rested in his open palm, offered like something fragile and dangerous at the same time. She knew what it was before he said anything else. She'd heard him talk about his dad before. About how he always answered. About how he never ignored a call. She also knew what pressing that button could mean. The men noticed the exchange immediately. Their laughter paused, curiosity flickering across their faces. One of them leaned closer, peering down at the phone, his mouth curling into a grin that carried more arrogance than intelligence. "What's that?" he asked. "You calling someone?" Another laughed, louder this time. "Who you gonna call, huh?" The boy swallowed hard. "My dad." That did it. They erupted. The sound was ugly, sharp, mocking, dismissive. The kind of laughter that only exists when people are convinced they're untouchable. "Go ahead," one of them said, spreading his arms theatrically. "Send it." Another chimed in, sneering. "Yeah, let's see who comes running." They looked at the girl now, eyes narrowed, daring her. Testing her. Confident she wouldn't. Confident it was all a bluff. She looked down at the phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen. This was the moment where everything could change. Or nothing at all. Her heart pounded so hard it made her dizzy. Thoughts raced through her mind faster than she could sort them. What if nothing happened? What if it made things worse? What if the men took the phone, broke it, hurt the boy more? What if pressing send didn't matter? She looked at the boy again. At the way he sat so still, like he was bracing for impact. At the way his eyes never left her face, trusting her with something far bigger than a message. Trusting her with hope. She thought about all the times she'd wished someone would call for help for her. All the times no one had. Her thumb trembled. The men leaned in closer, their presence crowding her space, their voices a low chorus of taunts. "Come on," one of them said softly. "Do it." She hesitated. Just for a second. Then she pressed send. The sound was barely audible. A soft confirmation tone swallowed immediately by laughter. "There," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I sent it." The men laughed harder. One of them clapped slowly, mock applause echoing through the parking lot. "Wow," he said. "Real scary." Another shook his head. "You really think some guy's gonna show up and save you?" They turned away from the phone almost instantly, dismissing it as nothing. A joke. A bluff. Another thing to ridicule. But something had already changed. The air felt different. The girl felt it first, a shift deep in her chest, like something irreversible had been set in motion. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know when. But she knew this wasn't just hope anymore. It was action. Somewhere, far beyond the edges of that parking lot, a message had landed. And with it, a countdown began. Not spoken out loud. Not announced. Just ticking forward, second by second. 11 minutes. 10:59. 10:58. The men didn't hear it. The boy felt it. The girl stood a little straighter. And if you've ever seen cruelty ignored, comment, "Not on my watch." The moment after the message was sent was worse than everything that came before it. Cruelty doesn't always explode. Sometimes it leans in closer, confident, curious, eager to punish hope itself. The men didn't back away. They didn't hesitate. In fact, they seemed energized by the idea that nothing was going to happen. That the girl's small act of defiance had changed nothing at all. One of them laughed and shook his head slowly, like a disappointed teacher. "That's it," he said. "That's your big move." Another stepped closer to the boy, crouching slightly so his face was level with his. "You really think your dad's coming?" he asked softly. "You think anyone's coming?" The boy's hands tightened on the armrests until his knuckles went white. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His breathing was shallow now, fast, the kind that comes when fear is pressing in from every side. The homeless girl shifted instinctively, placing herself between the man and the chair again. Her heart was racing, but she didn't step back. She couldn't. Not now. Not after pressing send. The man noticed the movement and smiled thinly. "You're real stubborn," he said. "You know that." He shoved her again, harder this time. She stumbled, catching herself just before falling, pain flashing through her shoulder. A few people nearby gasped. One person shouted something unintelligible from across the lot. No one stepped in. The men fed on it. Their voices grew louder, sharper. They spoke not just to intimidate, but to perform. They wanted the audience to see who was in control. They wanted the laughter, the phones, the fear. "Bet the cops won't even bother," one of them said casually. "By the time anyone shows up, we'll be long gone." And that part wasn't bravado. It was realism. Because police don't materialize instantly. Calls stack up. Dispatchers triage. A disturbance in a supermarket parking lot doesn't always rise to the top when there are accidents, domestic calls, emergencies happening elsewhere. Especially in a town where trouble usually stays quiet. Older viewers know this. They've waited for help before. They know the gap between calling and arrival. They know how long minutes can stretch when you're vulnerable. The men knew it too. They were counting on it. One of them kicked the wheel of the chair again, a little harder this time. The metal rattled. The boy cried out despite himself, the sound raw and panicked. The father moved instantly, stepping forward, his voice sharp now, cutting through the noise. He told them to stop. Told them to step away. Told them this was done. The men turned toward him slowly. They sized him up. Plain clothes. Calm posture. No shouting. No visible fear. They laughed. "You think you're scary," one of them said. "You ain't nothing." The father didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because he wasn't watching them anymore. He was listening. Listening to his phone. At first, it was just a vibration in his pocket, easy to miss in the noise of the parking lot. But he felt it. Felt it the way he always did, like an alarm that didn't rely on sound. He reached down slowly, deliberately, pulling the phone free. One message. Short. Urgent. No explanation. No extra words. Just enough. Everything inside him went quiet. The noise of the parking lot faded. The laughter. The shouting. The boys' cries. It all fell away as his mind locked onto the message and began running through possibilities with ruthless efficiency. He didn't panic. He never did. Panic wastes time. He scanned the scene again, taking in positions, distances, exits. He saw his son's fear. He saw the girl standing where she shouldn't have had to stand. He saw the men for what they were, loud, sloppy, emboldened by the assumption that no one powerful was watching. They were wrong. He didn't move yet. He didn't announce anything. Because leadership isn't about reaction. It's about timing. He typed a reply with one hand. 2 words. "On my way." And then, without looking down again, he slid the phone back into his pocket. The men noticed none of this. They were too busy enjoying themselves. They closed in tighter now, voices overlapping, insults flying freely. One of them leaned close to the girl's face, invading her space deliberately, daring her to flinch. "You still standing?" he said. "Thought you'd be gone by now." Her legs shook. Her arms ached. Her heart felt like it might burst through her ribs. But she didn't move. Because somewhere deep down, she knew something had shifted. She didn't know what it would look like. She didn't know when it would arrive. But she knew that pressing send had mattered. The men didn't. They mistook her stillness for fear. They mistook the father's restraint for weakness. They mistook time for safety. The countdown continued, unseen and unheard. The police were still minutes away. Dispatch had logged the call. Units were finishing higher priority responses. Help was coming, but not fast enough to stop what was happening now. And the men knew it. They pushed harder. They raised their voices. They wanted to end this on their terms before consequences could catch up. The boy sobbed openly now, humiliated and terrified, his face buried in his hands. The girl reached back blindly, placing a steadying hand on his arm, whispering words meant only for him. "It's okay," she said, even though she wasn't sure it was. "I'm here." The father stood perfectly still, watching, waiting, because he understood something the men didn't. Time wasn't on their side. It was on his. And with every second that passed, with every cruel word spoken, with every shove and laugh and insult, they were digging themselves deeper into a moment they would never be able to outrun. The countdown continued. Unforgiving. Unstoppable. And the men had no idea what was already on its way. If stories like this matter to you, stories where kindness stands up to cruelty, where ordinary people refuse to look away, then this channel is for you. Hit subscribe if you believe silence helps the bully and courage deserves an audience. Because every time you subscribe, you're choosing a side. And this channel will always stand with the vulnerable. The message landed without fanfare. No alarms. No dramatic sound. Just a vibration against leather and denim, felt more than heard. For the man who received it, that was enough. He didn't reread it. Didn't ask questions. Didn't need clarification. The words were short, direct, and unmistakable in their urgency. Years of responsibility had trained him to recognize the difference between noise and necessity. This was necessity. He stood up immediately. Not abruptly. Not with urgency that spilled into panic. Just a controlled rise to his feet, the kind that signals decision rather than reaction. Around him, the space was alive with motion, men adjusting gear, checking straps, wiping chrome, exchanging quiet words. The air smelled of fuel and metal and morning heat. No one asked what was wrong. They saw it on his face. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't wave his arms. He didn't call for attention. He didn't have to. He moved. And movement, in that space, was language. He walked toward his bike, steps measured, shoulders squared. The men closest to him fell into step without thinking. Not because they were ordered to, but because they understood. They'd learned long ago to read the subtle shifts. The quiet signals that meant something had changed. One of them noticed the phone sliding back into his pocket. Another caught the tightening of his jaw. A third saw the way his eyes sharpened, not angry, not wild but focused. Purposeful. That was all it took. Engines that had been cooling were checked again. Gloves went on. Helmets were lifted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The atmosphere shifted in a way that didn't need explanation. This wasn't a meeting. This wasn't a discussion. This was response. Somewhere in that controlled chaos, a rider swung his leg over his bike and thumbed the ignition. The engine turned over with a low growl, steady and sure. Another followed. Then another. The sound spread, not all at once, but in waves. A deep, rolling thunder that vibrated through the ground and into the bones of everyone present. One by one, engines came alive, each adding its voice to a growing chorus that felt less like noise and more like momentum. There were no speeches. No rallying cries. No dramatic declarations. No one needed to be convinced. They didn't ask who was wrong. They asked where. Maps were pulled up in gloved hands. Routes were chosen instinctively, efficiency over spectacle. Riders moved with the kind of coordination that comes only from years of shared road, shared risk, shared understanding. One man tightened another's strap without being asked. Another passed along a signal with a nod. Someone adjusted formation spacing automatically. This wasn't chaos. This was precision. The man at the center of it all mounted his bike last. Not out of ceremony, but habit. Leadership wasn't about being first. It was about being seen, being steady, being certain. He sat for a brief moment, both boots planted firmly on the ground, hands resting on the grips. His breathing was slow, controlled. Inside, his mind ran through checklists without effort. Distance, time, traffic, risk. All of it mattered. But none of it mattered more than one simple truth. His son was scared. That thought didn't break him. It sharpened him. He looked up once, scanning the assembled riders. There were many of them. Far more than would ever be needed for intimidation alone. That wasn't why they were there. They were there because a line had been crossed. Because someone had called for help and been answered. He nodded once. Engines roared louder in response, as if the machines themselves recognized the signal. The sound was immense now, layered, powerful, unified. A living thing that rolled outward and upward, impossible to ignore. People nearby stopped what they were doing. Heads turned. Windows rattled. Birds scattered. The riders didn't wait for permission. They moved. One by one, then in tight succession, bikes rolled forward, tires gripping asphalt, engines settling into a synchronized rhythm. The formation took shape naturally, as it always did, without shouted commands or hand signals. They flowed into position like water finding its channel. The road ahead stretched open. And they took it. The sound followed them, echoing off buildings, carrying far beyond the limits of sight. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't reckless. It was steady, relentless, purpose-driven. On the highway, drivers slowed, instinctively sensing the weight of what was passing them. Some pulled over. Others watched in silence as the procession thundered by, stretching farther than seemed possible. This wasn't a few bikes. This was scale. Hundreds of engines moving as one, a rolling statement of presence and intent. Mile after mile, the sound didn't fade, it multiplied, bouncing off overpasses and tree lines, announcing itself long before it could be seen. Inside their helmets, the riders were silent. Each man alone with his thoughts, yet completely connected to the group. There was no need for conversation. No room for doubt. Everyone understood the assignment without it ever being spoken aloud. Protect. Arrive. Contain. The man leading them never looked back. He didn't need to. He knew they were there. They always were. He focused on the road, on the path unfolding beneath his front tire. His hands were steady. His posture unyielding. The machine beneath him responded like an extension of his will. The countdown ticked on, unseen by those who had started it. With every mile, the gap closed. With every second, the balance shifted. Somewhere ahead, in a parking lot that had become a stage for cruelty, men were laughing. Phones were recording. A boy was crying. A girl was standing where she shouldn't have had to stand. They didn't hear the engines yet. But they would. The riders didn't speed recklessly. They didn't need to. Momentum was on their side. Traffic parted. Intersections cleared. The sheer presence of the formation altered the flow of the world around it. This wasn't force, it was inevitability. On ramps filled with thunder. Exits emptied. The sound grew heavier, denser, as more riders merged seamlessly into the main line, each one answering the same call without needing to ask questions. They didn't ask who was wrong. They asked where. And now they knew. As the convoy advanced, something else traveled with it, something quieter than the engines, but just as powerful. Certainty. The certainty that someone had been heard. The certainty that someone had mattered. The certainty that no matter how small or invisible you felt, if you stood your ground when it counted, you weren't standing alone. The man at the front felt it settle into his chest like armor. He didn't think about consequences. He didn't think about optics. He didn't think about what would be said later. He thought about arriving in time. The road bent. The town drew closer. And the sound of 700 engines rolled forward like a promise that could no longer be undone. At first, it sounded like weather. A low, distant rumble rolling across the edges of the world, easy to dismiss if you didn't know what you were listening for. The men didn't notice it right away. They were too busy laughing. Too busy enjoying the space they thought belonged to them. but the ground felt it. A subtle vibration beneath their feet, traveling up through concrete and bone, steady and growing. The homeless girl felt it first. Not with her ears, but in her chest. A pressure. A presence. Something approaching with weight behind it. She turned her head slowly. The boy did too. His crying softened, hitching into silence as his eyes widened. He knew that sound. He'd talked about it 100 times. Dreamed about it. Memorized it. Engines. Not one. Not a few. Many. The laughter faltered. One of the men glanced toward the road, squinting. "What's that?" he muttered, irritation creeping into his voice. The rumble deepened, layered now, unmistakable. It didn't rush. It advanced. Rolling forward with patience and certainty, filling the air, drowning out everything else. Conversations around the parking lot died mid-sentence. Car alarms chirped and fell silent. Birds lifted from nearby trees all at once, startled into flight. The sound arrived before the sight. That was the promise. Then headlights crested the far end of the lot. One line. Then another. Then more than the eye could count. The thugs froze. Their confidence drained in real time, faces paling as the source of the sound revealed itself. Rows of motorcycles poured into view, stretching farther than seemed possible, filling entrances, exits, every open lane. Chrome caught the light. Leather moved as one. The noise wasn't chaotic. It was controlled. Deliberate. The men stepped back instinctively. Too late. The formation rolled in, wide and unbroken, surrounding the space without rushing it. No skidding stops. No revving for show. Just presence, absolute and undeniable. Then one by one, the engines cut. The sudden silence was staggering. After all that sound, the quiet landed like a physical force. It rang in the ears. It pressed down on the chest. You could hear breath again. You could hear fear. The homeless girl exhaled shakily, only then realizing she'd been holding her breath. Her legs nearly gave out, relief washing over her so fast it felt dizzying. She reached back, steadying herself against the boy's chair. The boy stared, or replacing terror. His mouth parted slightly, eyes reflecting a sea of bikes and men who hadn't come to hurt anyone, but to stop something that never should have started. The father stepped forward from the line. Calm. Measured. The same man who had stood quietly minutes before now carried the full weight of what had arrived behind him. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. The men who had laughed earlier couldn't find their voices now. They looked small. Surrounded not by fists, but by consequence. This was the moment the hook had promised. The sound that would shake the parking lot to its core had come and gone. And what remained wasn't violence. It was awe, fear, and overwhelming relief. Because for the first time since it began, the cruelty had nowhere left to stand. At first, no one understood what they were hearing. It crept in at the edges of the moment, a distant rolling hum that didn't belong to the parking lot or the afternoon air. It wasn't sharp like sirens. It wasn't chaotic like shouting. It was deeper than that. Heavier. The kind of sound that doesn't ask for attention, but takes it. The men were still laughing. They were still talking over one another, feeding off their own noise, convinced they had all the time in the world. The homeless girl felt it before she could name it, a vibration rising through the ground and settling into her chest. Her breath caught. She turned her head slowly toward the road. The boy did too. His crying faded mid-breath. His eyes widened, not in fear this time, but recognition. He described this sound before in stories and daydreams, tracing it in the air with his fingers. He knew it the way other kids knew the sound of their own name being called. Engines. Plural. The laughter faltered. One of the men frowned, glancing toward the far end of the lot. "You hear that?" he said, his voice losing its edge. The rumble grew thicker, layered upon itself, no longer distant enough to ignore. It rolled across asphalt and concrete, rattling windows, vibrating metal shopping carts. Conversations around the lot died out as heads turned in unison, drawn toward the same unseen source. The sound arrived before the sight. Then the sight arrived. Headlights appeared first, cresting the edge of the road like a slow-moving horizon of white and chrome. One line became two. Two became many. Rows upon rows of motorcycles poured into view, stretching farther back than the eye could follow, filling every entrance, every open lane. The men froze. The confidence drained from their faces as realization set in. This wasn't a local ride. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't something they could laugh off. They stepped backward instinctively, shoulders tightening, mouths opening without sound. The space they'd controlled moments earlier shrank rapidly as the formation rolled in, wide and deliberate, encircling the area without urgency, without chaos. No one ran. No one had to. The engines roared one last time as the bikes settled into position. Then, as if guided by a single thought, they cut. The silence that followed was overwhelming. After all that thunder, the absence of sound pressed down on the parking lot like a held breath. You could hear shoes scuffing against pavement. You could hear shallow breathing. You could hear fear where laughter had been. The homeless girl swayed slightly, relief crashing over her so fast it made her dizzy. Her hands trembled as she steadied herself against the boy's chair, tears blurring her vision. She hadn't known how heavy the moment had been until it lifted. The boy stared, washing away the humiliation and terror that had consumed him. His shoulders lowered. His hands relaxed. For the first time since it began, he felt small in the right way, protected, not powerless. The father stepped forward from the line of bikes. He didn't rush. He didn't posture. He moved with the same calm presence he'd carried all along, only now it was magnified by the sheer number of people standing behind him. He removed his helmet slowly, deliberately, and looked at his son first. Everything else faded. The men who had mocked and shoved and laughed stood frozen, finally understanding what they had stumbled into. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by something raw and unmistakable. Fear. This was the moment promised from the very beginning. The sound that would shake the parking lot to its core had come and gone. And what it left behind wasn't violence. It was silence. Oh. And the unmistakable relief of knowing that cruelty, for once, had been interrupted before it could finish its work. The man didn't raise his voice. That was the first thing everyone noticed. After all that sound, all that thunder and arrival, he didn't meet chaos with chaos. He stepped forward slowly, deliberately, as if the space itself had reshaped around him. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable, his eyes steady in a way that made shouting feel childish by comparison. He looked at the men one by one. Not with rage. With recognition. The kind that says, I see exactly who you are, and I am not impressed. No one moved behind him. No one spoke. Hundreds stood in absolute stillness, not because they were told to, but because they understood this wasn't their moment. This was his. And more importantly, this was his son's. You're done, the father said calmly. Not a threat. A statement. The men tried to speak all at once. Excuses tripped over each other. Words like joking and misunderstanding floated uselessly in the air. Their voices cracked under the weight of silence pressing back at them. The father lifted one hand. They stopped. You don't get to decide when it's a joke, he said evenly. You don't get to decide who deserves dignity. He turned slightly, placing himself fully between the men and the boy, his body a quiet wall of certainty. Then he gestured, not toward the bikes, not toward the crowd, but toward the girl. The homeless girl flinched, unsure why the attention had shifted to her. She stood where none of you did, he said, addressing everyone now. She protected my son when it wasn't safe. When it wasn't convenient. When no one was watching out for her. He looked back at the men. That makes her family. The word landed hard. Family. Behind him, no one cheered. No one moved. The meaning of it was enough. The girl's breath hitched. She shook her head slightly, overwhelmed, tears blurring her vision. No one had ever said that about her before. Not publicly. Not with conviction. Not with hundreds standing witness. The men didn't know where to look. The father didn't touch them. Didn't threaten them. He didn't need to. Accountability doesn't always require force. Sometimes it requires exposure. You're going to wait, he said. And you're going to answer for what you did. As if on cue, distant sirens approached, not rushing, not dramatic, but steady. The police arrived moments later, stepping into a scene already resolved in the most important way. There was no chaos to break up. No violence to contain. Only facts. Witnesses. And men who no longer looked proud of what they'd done. Officers spoke quietly. Questions were asked. Statements taken. The process moved forward with the weight of inevitability. The moral reckoning had already happened. This was just the paperwork catching up. The father knelt beside his son then, his voice softening, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "You did good," he said. The boy nodded, eyes shining, not from fear now, but from relief. The girl stood nearby, unsure where she belonged. The father looked up at her again. "You belong here," he said simply. And in that moment, dignity won. Not through fists. Not through fear. But through restraint, recognition, and a refusal to become what needed stopping. If you believe real strength protects instead of destroys, subscribe. This channel tells those stories. The boy sat quietly now, his breathing steady, his hands resting loosely in his lap. The fear that had twisted his face earlier was gone, replaced by something softer, something stronger. Pride. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that settles in when you realize you made it through something hard and came out whole. He looked up at his father, not needing to say anything. The look they shared carried everything: trust, relief, and the unspoken understanding that safety had returned. The world felt solid again beneath his wheels. Around them, the parking lot no longer felt like a stage for cruelty. It felt changed. People moved differently. Slower. More aware. Some avoided eye contact, shame lingering in the way they held themselves. Others looked openly, their expressions softened, thoughtful, shaken by what they had witnessed. A few approached quietly. Not with excuses. Not with explanations. Just small acknowledgments. A nod. A whispered, "I'm sorry." A hand pressed briefly to the heart. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened. But it was something. The girl stood off to the side, unsure of where to put her hands, unused to being noticed without judgment. She expected the attention to fade, expected herself to slip back into the background once the moment passed. Instead, it didn't. Someone brought her water. Someone else offered a clean jacket. Not tossed. Not dropped at her feet. Handed to her, like she mattered. Like a neighbor. Like a person. The father spoke to her quietly, away from the crowd. Not about money. Not about pity. About options. About support. About help that came with dignity instead of strings. She listened carefully, guarded but hopeful, feeling something unfamiliar settle into her chest. Belonging. The boy watched her as they spoke, a small smile forming at the corner of his mouth. He understood something then that would stay with him for the rest of his life, that strength isn't always loud, and heroes don't always look the way stories prepare you for. Sometimes they look like someone the world forgot. The engine started again, not all at once, but gently this time. A low hum. Controlled. Purposeful. Not a warning anymore. A farewell. As the riders prepared to leave, the sound rolled through the space one last time, not as thunder, but as reassurance. People stood still, watching, not filming now. Just witnessing. When the last bike pulled away, the lot felt quieter than before. Not empty. Peaceful. The girl stood there, wrapped in borrowed warmth, standing taller than she had that morning. She thought about how invisible she'd felt when the day began. How small. How easily ignored. She thought about how quickly that had changed. She thought she was invisible. That day, 700 people proved she wasn't. And if you refuse to stay silent when someone is being hurt, comment, "I take a stand." If this story touched something in you, don't keep it to yourself. Share your story in the comments. Tell us what you faced, what you survived, or who you stood up for when it mattered. This isn't a comment section, it's a place where people look out for each other. Every word counts. Every scar tells a story. And every voice here matters, because that's what real family does. This isn't just another video you scroll past. It's part of something bigger. A reminder that courage still exists, that kindness still shows up, and that protecting the vulnerable is the truest kind of strength. So stand with us. Speak up. Be counted. Because somewhere out there, another child, another forgotten soul is watching, waiting for proof that the world still cares.